I welcome you all to the 2020 Fall Franciscan Zoom lectures hosted by the Franciscan School of Theology. Dr. Joseph Chinnici, OFM, is President Emeritus of the Franciscan School of Theology. As former chair, also of the Secretariat for the Retrieval of the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition, he has worked for the last 20 years to present the riches of the Franciscan spiritual, theological, and social vision in a contemporary context. In this short lecture, he will elucidate some of the dimensions of the Franciscan vision that surface in the present approaches of Pope Francis. We also look forward to Father Joe's forthcoming and pioneering book on the history of the Church in the United States since World War II, and American participation in the Second Vatican Council. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome Father Joe Chinnici.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for attending this lecture. Let me begin right away with a prayer. The prayer is in Francis's Encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. It's very short, but it gives you some of the key ideas for sure, or at least the animating spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. Amen. So I decided to ask just a question: how does this encyclical play in the United States? And I'm not sure that it will in our present circumstances, but I think it gives some guidance to us as the direction in which we should go. On Fraternity and Social Friendship was issued October 3rd, 2020. Let me just give you an outline. It's a very dense encyclical, sometimes wandering and very long. So 40 minutes is hardly going to do even the surface of it. And I'm going to approach it a particular way. So I'm not going to try to cover the whole thing. But it has an introduction where Francis talks about significant encounters. I'll mention a couple of them. Note chapter 1 begins with kind of a phenomenology of the current circumstances in the globe, not in the United States, although it's certainly reflected in our society, but in the globe itself. Dark clouds over a closed world. And the vision in chapter 3, under Vision of Society, is envisioning and engendered an open world. So he's going to contrast some of his discernment of the present world with the open world he believes is the future. Then it's followed by a gospel lens, and I'll explain that as we go along. The second part of it is the vision he has for society, an open world, a heart open to the whole world, and a better kind of politics. The third way are kind of ways to get there: dialogue, friendship in society, and renewed encounter. So he's going from an analysis to a vision to pathways to get to the vision. And only at the end does he bring in the role of religion. So the religion itself, all religions, should be in service to a mission. The world is not in service to the religion. Religion is in service to the world. That's very much picking up the vision of Vatican Council II. So he starts with the signs of the times externally to the church. So what do people need? As we'll see, this is a very Ignatian dictated vision, certainly part also of our Franciscan tradition. And he interprets what's happening through the lens of the gospel. A heart open to the world. The whole encyclical addresses the issues not so much of analysis and reflection, but issues of the heart. And this becomes very important because it touches our affections and our desires. This will be significant in a world dominated by consumerism, which touches really our affections and our desires, not necessarily how we think. Key terms arise throughout the encyclical. Let me just give you a few of them. Communion, bonding, relationships, fraternity, heart, hospitality, care, mature love, friendship. This is a very relational universe he's trying to create and appeal. And he concludes then with an appeal. We'll come back to that. So I want to first give you some clues as to how to understand this man. His teaching follows in the wake of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and very much converges with their social vision in Sollicitudo Rei Socialis and in Caritas in Veritate by his previous pontiffs. But he brings a whole different experience. Remember, the two previous pontiffs were Europeans, okay? John Paul II, clearly Middle European and shaped very much by the Polish experience. Benedict, Middle European, shaped very much by the German experience. And so this is an entirely different world he comes to that Pope Francis does. He is shaped by this Argentine experience, something we always need to remember and comes out clearly to me. And remember also, he's the first member of the Society of Jesus in history to become a pope. Okay, so he's shaped by the Ignatian tradition. And he's the first pontiff in history to take the name Francis. We have got to give him his uniqueness, at the same time understand him in continuity with the church. I want to talk about some of the initiation of processes of change, and then how it relates to the American society and what we've learned from the pandemic. So that's kind of the outline. It's a big task for 40 minutes, but we'll do the best we can. It begins with inspiring encounters. Now, the encounter he mentions initially clearly is Francis's encounter with the leper, and Francis's encounter with his brothers and sisters. The term fratelli includes men and women, in contrast to what people have said. I talked to Bill Short about this, and it's an inclusive term, men and women together. The encounters he's talking about, you note Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, Charles de Foucault, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King. Francis and the Imam are mentioned at the beginning. These people are mentioned at the end as encounters which inspire him. Note the geography involved: Africa, Asia, United States, North America, Europe, Egypt, and note the varieties of religious professions and faith involved in all of these people. So this is a encyclical dedicated to the universal needs of humanity. Those encounters are very important. And he's like himself. He learns through the example of others, and he's going to pick up the goodness in all of these people who are outstanding characteristics and shapers of contemporary culture. Those are the places where he mentions them. You know, in Fratelli Tutti, when this is posted, you can get the references if you care to. His convergence with Francis of Assisi. He cites Francis several times, and I'll come back to that. This is what he says: to worship is to draw closer to unity. to discover that we are children of the same Father, members of one family, as St. Francis discovered, to sing praises in unity to all creation and to all people. It is to retie the bonds that we have broken with our earth, with our brothers and sisters. It is to recognize God as Lord of all things, kind Father of the whole world. Again, the universality of the message comes out. There's a book called a Pope Francis Lexicon, and our Minister General was asked to contribute to it, a reflection on the convergence between Pope Francis of Assisi, or St. Francis of Assisi, and Pope Francis. And he picked out the following paths: the path of the poor, the path of Jesus, the path of the affections, the path of example, the path of the teaching word, and the path of reform through mission in the world. That's a nice little book if you are wondering about the terms that Pope Francis uses. And that's a good essay on Francis of Assisi. The cry of the poor. Hearing the cry of the poor is one of the convergences clearly with our own Franciscan way of life. We must not lose our ability to listen, the Pope says. St. Francis heard the voice of God. He heard the voice of the poor. He heard the voice of the infirm, and he heard the voice of nature. He made of them a way of life. My desire is that the seed that St. Francis planted may grow in the hearts of many. Fratelli Tutti 48. So that implies that we're tuned into the world. Our senses are open to it. We allow the world in its problems, its sufferings, its possibilities to enter into our heart. We hear with our heart. The word comes into us, the word that God has embedded in the world from the beginning. Hearing the cry of the poor, the starting point. And then he cites Francis in the following ways. Let all of us brothers, that's where he gets the title, Fratelli Tutti. He does not quote the second half, consider the good shepherd, which is admonition 6. He says instead, he injected, let all of us brothers, he encouraged us into a way of life marked by the flavor of the gospel. Pope Francis's notion is like yeast in the world. It's a very organic vision. It gives taste or salt to the world. Note the biblical images. So he doesn't quote the Good Shepherd, which would be a specifically Christian symbol. He says, let all of us brothers, and then goes on, as Francis reveals to us, a way of life with the flavor of the gospel. The second one he quotes is, blessed is that servant who loves and respects his brother or sister as much when he is far away from when he is with him. So this is a vision that covers universal space, not just the people we can see, but the people we can't see. Not the people near, but the people that are far away. Francis felt himself a brother to the sun, the sea, and the wind, and he quotes Fratelli Tutti 2, Laudato Si. We've talked a little bit about his creation theology. That is Pope Francis. And then he cites the earlier rule, 16.3. When they go among the Saracens and other non-believers, without renouncing their own identity, they are not to engage in arguments or disputes, but to be subject to every creature for God's sake. These are very significant citations that open up a pathway for Pope Francis. He's a Jesuit who's taken the name Francis and refers to Francis all the time, much more so than he does to Ignatius. But I think he senses there's something political, maybe referring to Ignatius, everybody would say, including his fellow bishops. Oh yeah, he's a Jesuit. So he takes a universal saint. Francis is much more universal, appealing across all boundaries. Ignatius has some other baggage that we won't go into to associate with militant. At any rate, Pope Francis grew up in a context where, as with the Franciscan friars and sisters and brothers, the Society of Jesus went back to its roots. And those roots they found in the Ignatian exercises. And one of the pioneers in this was a French Jesuit, Gaston Fessard. We don't need to know a lot about him, but I just want to point out this inheritance. And Fessard argued a couple of things about the spiritual exercises that we see coming out very clearly in Francis, the Pope. He talks about the dialectic between the infinite and the finite. It's reduced to a simple phrase of Ignatius. We must not allow ourselves to be limited by the greatest, and yet to be contained in the tiniest. This is divine. So we don't ascend to the heavens, but we find the heavens in the tiniest, the earth. We don't ascend to God, we find God's presence in human beings. Francis translates that in a very homely way, which we would expect, keeping our feet on earth to avoid losing our way to heaven. So Christianity, Catholicism is not about some kind of perfection, angelism, making God presence on earth. It's discovering the infinite presence of God in the finite universe. Very, very incarnational. And this is one of the ways in which our Franciscan tradition influenced Ignatius Loyola. It's translated by the Latin phrase, "Cielo animo," my spirit is in heaven, "Roma corpore," Rome contains my body. So you put the earth and heaven together by acting, by being on mission. It's a dialectic, as he describes it, Fessard, between two freedoms. God's freedom, who chooses to love me. My freedom, when I choose to love God in my neighbor. It's a free choice. There's a great emphasis in Francis, Pope Francis, and in Ignatius, and in Francis of Assisi. The emphasis is on the will, our choice, our freedom to choose. Trust as if everything depended on God, and work as if everything depended on oneself. Again, kind of a summary. Another thing he picks up, and this is related to finding the infinite in the finite, the limited nature of who we are, who the world is, its constructions, its processes, its organizations, its church. That's all finite. That's all very limited. It's not perfect, and we cannot expect perfection. But Pope Francis brings us back to the individual desire for change in the individual moment. What are our desires? Where do our affections lead us? Well, we want fullness. We want peace. The horizon of the future, happiness, complete joy, complete peace, the fruition of our friendships, peace on earth, justice for all. These are the things that draw us forward, but they're never accomplished. We accomplish them only through finite processes. So Francis's methodology is not to complete things, but to start a process that then develops over time with the grace of God and the freedom of other people. So we see him doing that in synodality. We see that in the things he drops in terms of, let's say, the openness of the Eucharist to people. We see that in his actions, his symbolic actions of caring for the poor. He doesn't present us with a vision. He presents us with desire, affection, the desire to witness somehow to the presence of the infinite, which we can never grasp, in the finite. Sometimes, he writes in Evangelii Gaudium and Fratelli Tutti, I wonder if there are people in today's world who are really concerned about generating processes of people building, as opposed to obtaining immediate results, which yield easy, quick, short-term political gains, but do not enhance human fullness. Time is greater than the space that can capture the absolute. He takes history and time very seriously. What does it mean to be a Jesuit? He's asked this question and he answers it. It means to recognize oneself as a sinner, but called by God to be a companion of Jesus Christ, as Ignatius was. And that's his motto. Sinning, but chosen. Atque eligendo, but chosen. Sinning, suffering, moving, pilgrim, etc. But chosen by God. The finite, which I am, chosen by the infinite to give witness to the horizon that lies beyond everything. This tied in very much for me for a phrase he picks up in Fratelli Tutti. One path of us, we have to do this, is the cultivation of a penitential memory. We saw this develop in the United States with Black Lives Matter. And so it did. I mean, do we appreciate, do we understand, do we even bother to remember the history of the African American in the United States? Francis is going to argue the cultivation of a penitential memory is key to recovering this openness to all who suffer, because we inherit that in our society. So the bottom picture there is the new museum in Montgomery, Alabama, where they have all this display of the lynchings that occurred from 1880 through the 50s, 1950s in the South and elsewhere, I could add. On the right, you have a picture of Captain Jack, who was the head of the Modoc tribe in Northern California. I'm not sure we know, or people know a lot about the history of the Native Americans in California, where a recent book came out from Stanford called American Genocide after 1850, when the natives lost all their rights and actually became like animals who were hunted and then killed and decimated by the US government, I might add, and it was all legal, embedded in the law. Do we actually remember that? Do we have a penitential memory for these people? And he refers to Francis, so he picks this up from the Truth Commission in South Africa. We can think about the memory they have of in Poland, or the memory the church shies away from about sexual abuse. Francis's view is very communal. And the Jesuit motto, Deus Semper Maior. God is always greater than we think, certainly, or we imagine. So he uses a phrase, belief in the God who always surprises us. And here's the definition of a Jesuit. To be a Jesuit means to be a person of incomplete thought, of open thought, because he thinks always looks to the horizon. His thought always looks to the horizon, which is the ever greater glory of God. Our thought cannot capture the infinite wisdom of God. So our thought is relativized. And this will play in very strongly to his critique of any ideology, political, economic, any attempt to capture everything and fix it at a point. This certainly has application to the United States. He quotes the spiritual exercises. I will consider how God labors and works for me and all the creatures on the face of the earth. That is, he acts in the manner of one laboring. Note, God works for us if our eyes are open, if our heart is open, in every person that is, and in our historical events. For God does not see with his eyes, God sees with his heart. And God's love is the same for everyone, regardless of religion. Even if they are atheists, God's love is the same, and he sees to see them. So Francis comes from a spiritual experience, very much founded on the Ignatian tradition. Lastly, the issue of mercy. It is very necessary, this is him, Pope Francis, writing in Studies in Spirituality. It is very necessary that the one dealing with our neighbors, in order to cure them, should be like a good physician. We note that that image comes up also in Francis of Assisi. They should neither be frightened at the neighbor's illnesses, nor be repelled by their wounds. They should accept with great patience and gentleness their neighbor's weaknesses and importunities. To this end, they should regard our neighbors not as children of Adam and vessels of frail glass or clay, but as images of God, purchased by the blood of Jesus Christ. That little phrase there applies to every human being on the earth. So he's going to take this heritage of Francis of Assisi, and he's going to take the heritage of Ignatius and combine them into a vision of society. I don't think enough attention is paid to the spiritual inheritance of Francis. He is a Jesuit. He read Bonaventure and Novitiate. He was influenced by Francis. He cared for the poor. And he's trained in a religious spirituality. He's the first religious to become Pope since Pope Gregory XVI, 1832 to 1848. And Pope Gregory XVI was a Benedictine. He's the first one to come out of this evangelical awakening that happened in the 13th century and carried through into the Catholic reform, of which Ignatius is an icon. So he sees things from the viewpoint of spiritual experience. Everything. You can't understand him unless this is appreciated. We translate his writings and things like that into concepts. What he's trying to do is to communicate a spirit. And his words are communicating his heart. It doesn't work the other way around. The other third dimension of his early experience is the Argentine experience, the theology of the people. And I want to, this is throughout chapter 5 of Fratelli Tutti. And it's a response to Vatican Council II, peculiar to Argentina. So we're not talking about Peru. We're not talking about Central America. We're not talking about what most people think of when they think of liberation theology. Argentina had a very unique tradition of liberation theology that they called the theology of the people. And it was the radical identification of ordinary people of any class. So it was very leveling. The first characteristic of the poor coming from marginalization is a consciousness of needing others. And the poor and our own poverty lead us to need others. That's an important dimension here. It's a rejection of ideologies, any ideology. He grew up in an environment, as we'll see, of populism, Juan Perón, that exploited people for its own benefit. I think we've heard that before. He experienced an economic liberalism, a free market that served the powerful, in this case, colonial forces in Argentina. He experienced firsthand a leveling globalization. He saw developing in his society a hyper-individualism and what he refers to as a financial totalitarianism. the control of people's thinking or the shaping of people's thinking by a market mentality. This theology of the people reacts against all of those divisions and dimensions and starts with the notion of cultural formation and the religiosity of the pueblo, from whom comes the desire for peace and justice, so that people become active agents in history, everyone, not passive victims. So they're not divided into classes like Marxism does, classes that are at war until you have the victory of the proletariat. Victims needing conscientization. If I only taught these people enough about how they're oppressed, then they will rise up and throw the others overboard. This is not Marxist. This theology of the people is about cultural formation. It moves beyond class division, beyond economic division, beyond political division. People, for Francis, as he says in the Encyclical, is a symbolic category, a mythic category that carries a shared identity. We would say the American peoples have a long political, social, cultural inheritance. We associate it with the Declaration, or we associate it with the Constitution, or with the settlement over religious freedom and liberty, all of those things. That's what categorizes America as a people, and respect for law, no one's above the law, etc. So the central theme of his vision goes back to Gaudium et Spes, Medellin, and Puebla in Latin America, and has a unique Argentine expression. He picks up Lumen Gentium 9. It has pleased God to make men and women holy and to save them, not as individuals without any bond between them, but rather as a people. We are saved as a people, not saved simply as individuals. Individuals are saved, but always in the context of a people, a family, a community. And he sees it that way, who might acknowledge God in truth and serve him in holiness. Interesting comment, which he gives to the people of God in Chile after the sexual abuse crises, applies in many different directions. Whenever we have tried to replace or silence or ignore or reduce the people of God to small elites, let's say clericalism, which he criticizes extensively, which is a small elite, we end up creating communities, projects, theological approaches, ideologies of control, spiritualities and structures without roots, without memory, without faces, without bodies, and ultimately without lives. We try to grasp other people with the powers of our own position or our own reason or our own cadre of people. And we do all kinds of things, and we take the law into our own hands to control people through these actions. What he's after in that context then is social friendship in service to the common good. And Fratelli Tutti is very strong against a nationalistic populism that uses people, exploits them, and is really unconcerned for their differences. Everybody fits into a category. And he's against an economic system that serves the interest of the powerful. What he wants is a theology of the people and a social system, an economic system that serves all people. It has nothing to do with capitalism or socialism. He's not a socialist. That just misses the whole point. And he came out of the experience of Argentina's dirty war. The term dirty war came from the use of the military junta, gave it that name. And it's after they threw out Isabel Perón in 1976, and they took over Argentina and began to kill grab and kill all what they consider dissidents. All this was in reaction to the fear of communism. Anyone suspected of socialism, over 30,000 people disappeared. This is 1976 to 83. And he is Jesuit provincial, grows up in this environment, 1973 to 79. He sees the abuse of people by power. And he also sees, in response to this situation, the church itself divided. These particular categories are taken from a social study done of Argentina. So the anti-secularists cut through the church. They want no accommodation with the modern world. They must conduct a holy war and to save everyone and Christian civilization. The bishops belonging to this cadre of people are militant and connected very much with national identity and with the military establishment itself. The institutionals are another group of people. They're not so much connected with the political powers. They believe in some kind of change, but it should be always under the direction of the hierarchy. So they want to maintain the hierarchical structure of the church at all costs. They want to obtain privileges from the state, and so they make compromise with it. They're silent about the crimes in the society around them because that would risk their social advancement and support. So this is very much a church turned in on itself. And there are what this particular study calls the committed. Those would be, let's say, the proponents of the theology of the people. Very interesting analysis of the church. And when Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he preaches, and I mention this because it's very interesting. Every year, as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, on May 25th, that's the date when Argentinians celebrate their independence, 1810. Francis gives an interpretation of Emmaus, 1999, Zacchaeus, 2002, and then the Good Samaritan, 2003. He gives an interpretation of those parables, stories, gospel stories. He interprets life in the light of the gospel and argues strongly against any ideology, any pragmatism that uses people to achieve one's own ends. He argues against administrative narrowness and against forgetting our identity as a people of who we are. His aim in these homilies, which I've read, is to construct a democratic culture, to create a more just society, to establish social friendship, and to capture the aspirations of the people in a utopia, but root those aspirations in their historic memory of liberation. For us, it would be our historic memory of what has been given to us, both the purification of our memory in what we've done wrong and the desire of our memory for, let's say, equality. Politics must be at the service of social life. And we have to create a system that recognizes people's wounds. He argues for a dialogue between political parties. This is Fratelli Tutti captured in little homilies that he gave. So you can see that the encyclical that he wrote came from Francis of Assisi, Ignatius Loyola, the Argentine experience over long experience of life and its impact on him as a human being and how he came to understand the world. This is very different than John Paul or Benedict, although it's convergent, I might add, with their social theory. And after he's elected Pope, His desire is to start processes, not to bring them to conclusion. So I'm going to mention some of these processes as we move along here. First, unity between East and West. So 2014, just a year after he was elected, he creates with Patriarch Bartholomew of the East a declaration on ecumenism and argues for a new fraternal encounter, a new and necessary step on the journey towards unity, which only the Holy Spirit can lead us, and argues for a common witness between the East and West. He's thinking here of how do people relate to each other in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq. How is the Christian community working there? Well, it's oppressed. It's, I can remember talking to a friar from Morocco and seeing that very clearly at one of our general chapters. They couldn't go outside. They couldn't have common worship, whatever. They feared for their lives. And the friar yelled out, "Oh, for a little gratuity in this world." I'll never forget that experience. So Francis tries to start a process. He's not condemning what's the evil he sees. He wants to start a process that plants the good and lets it grow. This is very evangelical. It is, in fact, what Jesus did. By working together in the service of humanity, recognizing the dignity of the person at every stage of life, the sanctity of family based on marriage, the promotion of peace and the common good, responding to the sufferings that afflict the world, multiple hunger, poverty, you name it, safeguarding the gift of creation and the need for authentic dialogue with Judaism, Islam, and other religions. Only commitment to this process, which is the capturing of the infinite in the finite, and the patience to let it grow, will address the situation of Christians in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. So he's about building bridges, as he says, not walls. And then another one, religious leaders against slavery, December 2nd, 2014. We didn't hear much about this I don't think, in the United States, when he gathered all these religious leaders together to protest against slavery's developing in the world. I just picked up this as an advertisement so you could see what's happening. See, it's a big world. The embassies of Ireland and the United Kingdom to the Holy See, together with Talit Akum, have the pleasure of inviting you to a discussion that creates peace over slavery. Women religious leaders against modern slavery. And then there's a summit that he calls in 2017 on organ trafficking and transplant tourism, February 7th and 8th. In the eyes of God, each human being is a free person, whether girl, boy, woman, or man, and is destined to exist for the good of all in equality and fraternity. Modern slavery in terms of human trafficking, forced labor, prostitution, organ trafficking, and any relation that fails to respect the fundamental conviction that all people are equal and have the same freedom and dignity is a crime against humanity. Up on the left, I listed the topics our US State Department has called about human trafficking, and the great sign, "I'm not for sale." So we see him picking up then the divisions in his world. And the fourth example I'm giving, and there are multiple examples, probably we don't pay much attention to them, this protest against slavery, this unity between East and West, the Christians in the Middle East, this protest and development against human trafficking, and now this argument, not an argument, but dialogue with the Imam on human fraternity for world peace, February 3rd and 5th, 2019, mentioned a couple times in Fratelli Tutti. we could say, well, it doesn't complete anything. It only starts something. That's his whole point. Starting to witness to the infinite embedded in the finite. We cannot capture it. What we want to do is engage it and give more witness to the glory of God. In the name of God, who has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, dignity, and called them to live together as brothers and sisters, this was signed by the Imam and Francis. Innocent human life that God has forbidden to kill, the poor, the destitute, the marginalized, orphans, widows, refugees, those exiled from their homes and countries, victims of war, persecution, and injustice, peoples who have lost their security, peace, and the possibility of living together in the name of human fraternity that embraces all human beings, unites them, and renders them equal. That's what that was all about. Fratelli Tutti, brothers and sisters all, was signed October 3rd, 2020, but it summarizes his whole social vision and his whole experience, Franciscan, Ignatian, Argentinian, the need to start processes of fraternity. As we conclude, let's look at, just ask ourselves a question. I don't want to get too deeply into this, but these are questions we have to ask in the context in which we live. What binds our society together? And there are two dominant models the social people tell us, Nicholas Lehman, Transaction Man, and Daniel Rogers, Age of Fracture, both brilliant books that describe the present situation in our development. Let's look at the market model of exchange. You have the Tokyo exchange, you have the European exchange, you have the stock market on the left, Tokyo in the middle, the exchange between that, and how the report of that, the economic report of that, dominates our life. The model is based on self-interested actors, an invisible hand somehow that is supposed to build on people's generosity, competition, sobriety, efficiency, merit, utility, how to get the greatest profit out of the least amount of work for oneself. It involves a weakening of interest in the common good and a weakening of custom, tradition, and solidarity. This is one extreme of market exchange. It's not a critique of, let's say, a creative and efficient capitalism. He's not concerned about that. He's looking at how that begins to dominate. So, for example, we have things that in educational circles where they want to measure the quality of a school by the amount of money its graduates earn. Well, if that's the measurement of a successful education, we might as well close up, because we're about something else. And then the transactional model of society, where there's a concentration on wealth and power. Public life needs to be marked by contention and division so that others can have power. It's a transaction skeptical of institutions, committed to deregulation, to the rational and efficient solution to problems, and negotiation in a global society is unacceptable. Well, you can see how the universalist position of Francis moves in a different direction. The methodology for the transactional model of society is the sowing of suspicion among people, mistrust, so they no longer relate to each other. It's the sowing of ideology of division. It's the destruction of memory. He has some very fine comments here, I think, on history and memory when he talks about how the memory is being taken away from the young, that is, their identity as a people, only so that some can have all and exercise power. What binds our society together? Do we see elements of this that influence ourselves or the world around us? He also talks about, and these, my word is enchantment, the enchantment of consumption, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas, Valentine's Day, Easter Bunny, etc. All of those things that surround us through consumption, which is individual desire and the satisfaction of it. That too impacts our wounds in American society. Not that goods are bad, they are good. Is the accumulation of goods at the expense of poverty good? Francis would say we need to use discernment. And so he reflects on the midst of the pandemic, again, beginning with experience, and asks us, what have we learned? Well, we didn't solve the problem of the financial crises, 2008. And it was not solved. It did not lead to a new ethic. I always remember the president, not to critique George Bush, but he did stand up in the middle of the burning towers and say, the solution to this is for the Americans to go out and buy. When so many people, there was so much witness there to a common good and common concern, but no, that wasn't the issue of how the rest of us were going to solve it. So he would say that financial crises led to greater individualism and increased freedom for the truly powerful. And people ask, what is going to happen after the COVID's over? Will it fuel conflict? And they've divided the church into red and yellow and blue zones. We suspect that the United States will be in a yellow zone, not in a blue zone. It's a little too generous. Francis writes in Fratelli Tutti, anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we were already doing or to refine existing systems and regulations is denying reality. We have seen too many gaps between those who have health care and those who don't, between the rich and the poor, between those with access and those without access, between those with power and those feeling powerless, between races. COVID has exposed our vulnerabilities and disrupted our customs, our routines, our schedules, our projects, our family, our relationships. We've discovered that technological solutions cannot solve every problem. And the insight. So he's discerning the impact of the pandemic, and he comes to this insight in Fratelli Tutti. Today, we recognize that we fed ourselves on dreams of splendor and grandeur and ended up consuming distraction, insularity, and solitude. We gorged ourselves on networking and lost the taste of fraternity. We looked for quick and safe results, only to find ourselves overwhelmed by impatience and anxieties. Prisoners of a virtual reality, we lost the taste and flavor of the truly real. This calls for a rethink applied to a style of life, our relationships, the organization of our societies, and above all, the meaning of our existence. And we discover now that the digital media lack physical gestures, facial expressions, moment of silence, body language, even the smells, the trembling hands, the blushes and perspiration that speak to us and are part of the human communication. All of this is a citation from Fratelli Tutti. That doesn't mean he rejects digital media. It doesn't mean that he rejects the proliferation of goods. It does mean he argues for brothers and sisters all and the subordination of these economic, political, medical realities to the common growth of the human being. And yet, with the pandemic, there's two revelations. We've discovered that we belong to a global community and we can only be saved together. We are brothers and sisters to one another. We need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are either all saved together, this is a people, or no one is saved. Poverty, decadence, and suffering in one part of the earth are a silent breeding ground for problems that will end up affecting the entire planet. Surely we've learned this from 9/11, from the economic crises of 2008, and now from the pandemic and from SARS. Surely we can discern a call of God, the infinite God, to create human fraternity. We can only be saved together. For God, and we also have discovered, God continues to sow abundant seeds of goodness in our human family. He sees the infinite in the finite. We began to realize that interwoven with and sustained by ordinary people valiantly shaping the decisive events of our shared history, those who provide the goods, those who work in the meat plants, caregivers, pharmacists, medical doctors, people who deliver food, all of that. We've discovered human community, global community, and we've discovered that in the heart of human beings is the presence of the infinite God. So he asks, what does it mean to be human? And he goes back to the story of the Good Samaritan, the love of neighbor, and the interior summons that moves our affections and desires not to the possession of goods, but care for our fellow human beings. And our religion should be in service to this fraternity. So he concludes with this. Others drink from other sources. For us, the wellspring of human dignity and fraternity is in the gospel of Jesus. From it, there arises for Christian thought and for the action of the church the primacy given to relationships, to the encounter with the sacred mystery of the other, to universal communion with the entire human family as a vocation of all. There's Francis, tears of love, tears of compassion, the scream, Guernica, ad majorem Dei gloriam. This is Francis's Fratelli Tutti. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Joe, for your lecture, which just delves into just some of the insights and elements of the Franciscan tradition within the recent writings of Pope Francis. As a reminder, this opportunity is brought to you by the Franciscan School of Theology Development Department. Let us give Father Joe a collective round of applause for this evening.